Hi there, my name is Peter Grindrod. I'm a Professor of Mathematics at the Mathematical Institute at the University of Oxford. And today I'm going to talk about cortex-like complex systems, what occurs within. Imagine a vast system of excitable and refractory neurons, 10 billion of them, and each individual neuron itself is excitable, meaning if it's perturbed with incoming signals, it can spike itself, and it's also refractory, meaning that if it's spiked just now, it can't spike again for a little while until all the neural chemistry becomes back in balance. The network itself is not a random network. We know quite a lot about it. It's highly modular, and the modules correspond to tightly connected parts of the neural network, 10,000 or so neurons within each module, heavily connected. 50 or 70% of the connections are present in the neuron-to-neuron connections within columns, within modules. But then the modules themselves are arranged in a kind of two-dimensional sheet where neighboring modules are kind of connected up loosely, and that sheet itself is corrugated up over the cortex, over the outer brain structure. So what do we have? We have the excitable refractory neurons themselves, we have the architecture which is highly modular, and we have some time delays. So if I'm in one module and I'm connected to a neuron in my own module or a different module, it's going to take some time for my spike to reach the recipient spike, and then they'll spike or not, depending on whether they're in a refractory period or whether they're excited enough. So that means that the whole system is really like a massive delay differential equation. If you throw in some stochastic elements, it doesn't make anything more difficult or improve matters. And the central question is when you have such an architecture and when you have such active and reactive nodes within such a network architecture, then what type of things usually occur within? Is it just a deterministic system that takes input stimuli to output actions and things like that? Or does it possess an inner life? I'm going to argue for the latter. Now, we can't reverse engineer a human brain because that would require getting down to monitoring 10 billion individual neurons. But we can reverse engineer a synthetic brain. So what we've set out to do at Oxford is to create a synthetic network climbing up to 1 billion and then 10 billion neurons, and put them within the architecture that we know to be present in cortex-like complex systems, and have parameters controlling the excitability, the refractive nature of neurons, as well as the time delays, the times it takes for signals from one neuron to reach another. And we can simulate all that. We don't have to build a computer to do that. Those computers already exist. And in particular, we can use computers with 1 million cores to enable us to simulate these vast delay differential systems. Now, what do we see when we do this? Well, we created such a system and we stimulated it in many, many different ways. That is to say, we picked a particular input neuron and just kept pinging it with some kind of signal going in, and then we look at how the whole responds. And then we pick a different neuron and we ping it there, we see how the whole system responds. And we carried out 1 million such experiments. What would we see? Would all the responses be the same? Would all of them be just passive responses, or would they be much more active and have a structure of their own? Well, the latter is true. The way we did this was to carry out such experiments and to watch what happened at a large number of neurons, synthetic neurons, when particularly there was an input neuron that was stimulated, and then do the experiment over and over. What did we find? Well, we could characterize the functional response in the case of each experiment, And we did that as follows. We looked at the firing across the brain, and we looked at the phase differences in the firing, so that we were able to take absolute time out of it and just talk about phase patterns. So these are dynamical patterns over time, absolute time doesn't matter, of repeated firings going across the synthetic cortex-like complex system while it's being stimulated at some neuron or another. We do that many, many times, and we can compare the outputs, that is, these phase patterns. To do that, we need a metric on phase patterns. And so we can come up with a kind of dissimilarity or similarity matrix. So we take all the thousands and thousands and thousands of experiments we've carried out, and we produce a big matrix showing similarities of the phase patterned response to these different types of perturbation. Finally then, we can block diagonalize that matrix, which is equivalent to clustering. What we do is we say, well, similar responses can be clustered together and they're of a class. And what do we find? We find that the complex-like system has a kind of hierarchy of internal latent class-like behaviors. So if we do 1 million experiments, we don't get 1 million different, we might get 10,000 different types of behavior, or more likely 1,000 different types of behavior. And each one of those types contains replicable and very, very similar responses to inputs. So the inner life of such a dynamical complex system really corresponds to a whole load of latent classes. They can't be seen from outside, they can only be observed with inside. And each one of those classes yields a certain type of dynamical behavior over time and across the brain. So what does the inner life of a cortex-like complex system look like? Well, it divides into a number of latent classes, some of them very prevalent, some of them not so prevalent, and that whole is in a kind of hierarchy. So we get highly localized, specialized classes, but some of those can be grouped up to be more general classes. Where do feelings come from? What is it like to be a human brain? Well, the experience of being a human brain must be to possess these internal classes, and then sensations of one class or another being locked in, being dominant at a time, are what it is like to be a human brain. Thus, if we have the architecture, if we have the chemistry, if we have the physiology of a human brain, so necessarily you're going to have these kind of latent classes of behavior, and the brain will enjoy a whole range of sensations appearing in one-to-one correspondence with those classes. So these classes are good candidates for qualia and feelings, aren't they? And sadly, we're going to have to deny the existence of philosophical zombies, because zombies are tricky, aren't they? They have all the stuff that we have, but they don't have feelings. But actually what we're showing here is that if you have all the stuff that we have, if you have the architecture, if you have the neurons, if you have the dynamics, if you have the time lags, then necessarily you have these inner latent classes which we're kind of arguing are in one-to-one correspondence with feelings. Now, the feelings would give a fast-thinking evolutionary advantage to brains, because once you've got one of these modes, one of these internal latent classes locked in, it kind of reduces the problem set for any immediate decision making, and reduces the domain of possible perceptions, what's going to happen next. Instead, what you have is a way of limiting the decision set, and therefore there's a sort of fast thinking advantage, pretty much exactly in the way that Kahneman describes in his Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow thesis about how an efficient brain can use shortcuts, can use heuristics in order to be agile and to make rapid decision makings. So at a local scale, the internal I'm going to call them modes. It's not the same as brain modes as functional modes, as was studied in Berlin more than 10 years ago. These are internal modes, these are latent classes of behavior. And each of those is dominated within a few modules and corresponds, those are columns in the cortex, and correspond to internal states and sensations. And I'm arguing that these are what philosophers call qualia, and the system's own experience as being in such an information processing mode. There's an evolutionary advantage to developing them, and so our brains have developed them. And as a kind of side effect of that evolutionary development, we've recognized these internal modes as sensations, and we experience the brain being in those modes. Over a large scale, then some of these internal sensations and feelings might become much bigger, like emotions, greatly limiting immediate information processing, what's going to happen next. Now, what we've shown in our work is that such internal latent modes certainly exist in cortex-like complex systems within very large-scale simulations. That creates its own big data problem, actually, because when we reverse engineer such large systems with 1 billion or up to 10 billion nodes, we have invented a big data problem, where, remember, in each experiment we want to classify the kind of phased firing behavior going on across the whole brain, and then we want to compare those experiment-wise to say, well, how many classes have we got, how different are they, and things like that. But this is all doable. This is work for data science. And the fact is that we can now reverse engineer such large-scale simulations, and we can see what occurs within. There are latent dynamical modes, and having those, experiencing those, is what it is like to be a human brain. There is nothing more. Thank you.